Hey everybody, Sawasdee krab. Welcome to Beer Time Story, a platform where beer and brewing knowledge is shared. For today's session, which is the first session ever for this platform, we're gonna have a good burp about home brewing through eyes of the pioneer. And speaking of the pioneer in home brewing world, I believe that not only me, but for most of us, in just a blink of an eye, would think of one person, and he is with us today, the man who even himself wouldn't believe how much impact he created throughout these years when he first stepped into the world of homebrewing probably 50 years ago. And I'm not being exaggerated at all. He's the man who sparked homebrewing movement and revolution in our time, the one who spread joy of homebrewing, and to me, the godfather of homebrewing. So please welcome our guest speaker, Charlie Papazian. Hello,
Great to be
Charlie.
here. Cheers.
Cheers. Like, cheers. Welcome to the platform, and thank you for joining us. It is such
Mhm.
an honor.
Pleasure
Yeah,
to be here.
thank you again. So yeah, you are in the middle of what, late winter and season,
Yeah,
right?
late winter and Mar. Yeah, in Colorado in the USA, and sometimes we get warm weather, sometimes we get snow. So
Right. So just live with what the nature give us, right?
it's always good time for beer, though.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I hope that you are doing fine, given the weather over there. Is it like considered to be a good brewing season throughout the year around this time for you, or any season doesn't matter?
Oh, I keep up with it. I brew on the average of still homebrew beer, 20 liters at a time,
Hmm.
and maybe on the average once a month, sometimes a little bit more, but that seems to keep family and friends
Going
going with homebrewers.
right, right. I just like sometimes a little bit more side. It's like always good to have some spare.
Yes.
All right, Charlize. Yeah. So I think we're gonna kick off by probably I'm gonna ask you to allow me to share a bit of your background before we walk through the session, and you can stop me and correct me if I present any misinformation. So you are a nuclear engineer, graduated in 1972.
Right, right.
Yeah, and after your graduation, you moved to Boulder, Colorado, and took a job as a school teacher.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
And one of the most interesting thing is you have a passion over delicious pies, so much so that you found National Pie Day sometime in 1975.
Yes, that I did that too. It's just a fun idea that just kind of got away from all of us, and now it's a national event that I'm not involved in. But
Yeah, I mean that is one of the I would consider to be one of the cool accomplishment for the National Pie Day. I also love pie, so thank you for that. Now, the real question is like, how were you drawn into beer and home brewing in the first place?
well, I was a student at the University of Virginia, and to be honest, I really didn't like the taste of beer. I was a college student. When I would drank beer, it didn't matter what I drank. It didn't matter really what it tasted like. Luckily for me, I didn't care because it didn't taste very good. And um, I was introduced by a neighbor friend where we lived off campus, and he said his neighbor uh, made homebrew. And I said, "What's homebrew?" And he said, "Well, homemade beer."
Hmm, hmm.
I said, "You can make that?" And he said, "Yes, let's go over to his house, and we
Hmm.
can try some." So we went over and visited. He was an old timer. He brewed during what we call Prohibition in the United States back in the 1930s,
So
late
the
20s.
dark era of home brewing, right? Like,
Yes, he's so his style of home brewing was uh, it was simple, it
mhm.
was effective, and it made beer that was drinkable. And I have to say, at the time, I thought it was fantastic. I thought the whole idea of making your own beer was fantastic.
Mhm.
And I tasted it. And it, I said, my goodness, how can we share the recipe with me? And he jotted down about 5 or 6 lines on a little 3x5 card.
Mhm.
And that was the beginning of my journey in home brewing.
Right. So basically, that was back when you were a college student,
Mm.
and so based on what U.S. market offered to the drinkers back then, like what kind of beer is available in the market around that
Well,
time?
in those days, it was
Hmm.
light lager, and the
And
other
like,
alternative was light lager. And
that's
it
great.
was cheap, and nobody really cared too much to talk about it because there wasn't
Right.
much to talk about it. Talk
Hmm.
about it. Um, and But this homebrew, the whole idea of making your own beer and sharing it with friends, that was when the seeds were planted for me. Because
Hmm.
I noticed after we started making beer, I have to say, my first couple of batches were not very successful. I had to throw it out, but I persisted, and
Hmm.
there was no information, no
Right.
books,
Right.
no net, no nothing there. So we just had to figure things out, and we were making a beer that was drinkable, and we loved it as college students. And the seeds were planted for realizing that it wasn't just about the beer, but the camaraderie and the
Mhm.
friendship, the appreciation for something that you you made yourself, and we're sharing it with friends, and it was contagious, just like it is nowadays. It's contagious when you share good beer with people that you've made yourself.
Yeah.
You get people involved.
Right. I can totally relate. So you mentioned that your, I would say, friend share you like a 5 lines of recipe, right, for your first batch.
Yes.
And I think we can just pull the photo up and let you just
Yeah,
walk through it
that's it.
really
That's
quick.
it.
This one, right?
That's literally a photograph I took of that card. And,
Wow.
5 gallons of water, 1 can of malt, Pabst Blue Ribbon brand,
Uh-huh.
lighter
Right. And that
dark.
is liquid one, right? Liquid
Yeah,
malt
liquid
extract.
syrup. You could get it at the grocery store.
Hmm.
And 1 can was about 3 pounds of malt,
Hmm.
maybe 2.5, 3 pounds, let's say, at the most.
Right. Right.
And 1.5 cans.
One
That
can, so
probably
yeah.
was about 4 or 5 pounds of sugar. So I was
Hmm.
adding more sugar than I was malt. So
Yes.
anybody who's done that will realize that that doesn't make the best beer, but at the time it made decent beer. And
Right.
the yeast was, we didn't know what kind of yeast. I have to
Hmm.
tell you, the first time I made this, I used cane sugar and I
Hmm.
used baker's yeast.
Baker
And
yeast, okay.
baker's yeast, the
Mhm.
yeast you make bread with.
Bread, yeah.
And it was not drinkable. It was very cidery and just didn't taste very good. But the
Right.
little tricks that I learned was that if you use dextrose or corn sugar, and you
Hmm.
used, you found the home brew shop. In those days, it was a winemaking supply shop that we would go to, and they had ale yeast for home brewing. It wasn't the best quality. It was dried, and you
Hmm.
didn't have a choice. You just took whatever they had, and that
Right.
made a difference. And we were able to make good beer.
It's great. And I also see from the instruction it say ferment till bubbling stop. And then it's just like
Right.
purely, based on the observation of, thing that's going around the activity, right?
That's right.
Hmm.
Yep. It was very unscientific. And, this kind of homebrew had a legacy
Hmm.
of exploding
Oh
bottles,
yeah. Right.
because there's no mention of hydrometers or, the danger of overcarbonation or
Right.
those kinds of things. So um, that was some of the things that I refined in my things that I published in the books and the lessons that I gave when I started teaching homebrew classes, which was called the Log Boom Brewing class. And
Okay.
which is what that poster is there.
Yes.
And when I was in Charlottesville, Virginia, going to the University of Virginia, it said brewed and bottled in Charlottesville, Virginia. So I just changed the label a little bit. So it was I started in Charlottesville and I continued when I moved to Boulder after I graduated.
Right. So basically, the first batch was in Virginia, right?
Virginia, yeah.
Okay.
And I'd like to just make one note. You don't see hops anywhere on this recipe.
Right.
Well, it was just assumed that the malt extract that you got from the supermarket was hop flavored.
Right.
So to be honest, I didn't even know what hops looked like or ever saw hops until I started brewing in 1970. It was probably about 1973, 3 or 4 years later, that I realized that hops were an ingredient you could vary and dose your beer with to get different results.
Right. So I mean, because like the bitterness is already included in the liquid form of the malted extract. That's why probably it's not going to be included in the recipe back then.
Right.
Okay, the log boom. That's great. And that is the logo of your bottle too, right? That you printed on the side of the bottle too. This log boom brew.
It was just a fun a logo that I use. Sometimes I had labels years ago. I ran out. It's just when you're home brewing as much as I did, putting labels on every bottle of beer. I keg off most of my beer now, except for the sour beers and the barley wines, the Scotch ales that are strong and like to age in bottles.
Right.
So
that's cool. All right. So like you shared, so you start your home brewing journey in early of 1970s, and you also began conducting a homebrew class in Colorado from 1973 onwards. Now, some of you may not believe this, but from present day lens, that was before home brewing was legalized in US, which was not until 1978 via the bill signed by President Jimmy Carter, right? So the real question is, what was home brewing scene like before it was legalized?
It was very enthusiastic. We helped each other a lot because, as I said earlier, there were books from England that were being imported into this country that we read, but a lot of it didn't make sense. And the reason why people brewed in England was to make cheap beer. It didn't matter so much about the character of the beer styles or flavor. It was to not have to pay a lot of money because taxes are so high in England.
Right.
So those books were a start, but they weren't very thorough and they weren't very clear. So what was your question again?
What was the home brewing scene like before it was legalized? They were very supportive and coming together. But does it have to be kept as a secret more under the water?
No, we didn't. We didn't keep it a secret. We figured that the government had better things than to arrest home brewers. And actually, I was interviewed on TV. The newspapers interviewed, and there were lots of stories published on my beer making class before it was legal. And so I really didn't. It really didn't bother me that we were making beer and it was technically illegal. Now, if you had a homebrew shop and a business, that is uncomfortable, and that's a whole nother story because you build a business and then you get busted, then you lose your business and a lot of money. But if they would bust me or another home brewer, would probably make headlines and make the news and just popularize the whole the whole hobby much more than they ever intended to. So it was a lot of people were enthusiastic because just about that time, in the United States, the airline industry was deregulated. And what that resulted in is that people could travel more often and less expensively. And a lot of people were going to Europe and different parts of the world, and they come back, especially from Europe, they come back and say, boy, I had such great beer over in Germany or Belgium or England. Why can't we get this kind of beer over here? Well, we couldn't. There were not many beers were imported into the United States in those days. So if you love good beer, you had to make it yourself.
Right.
And there were plenty of people that loved good beer once they tasted good homebrew. So, and it was contagious. It was word of mouth, and we celebrated. We shared our recipes, shared our failures, and helped each other make better beer.
Sounds incredible. And now, if I search my memory right, I remember a story about a suspicious student in one of your homebrew class back then. Like, can you just share us with such story?
Yeah, the interesting thing about my beer making classes, I taught them in the home that I rented, in the living room and the dining room, and there was usually about 20 people that would take the class, and half the people, interestingly, were women and half were men, and we had a lot of fun. The institution, the organization through which I worked to advertise and promote the class, and the class catalog, the people, they were called the Community Free School, and they gave me a call during registration and said, Charlie, you've been doing this for a while. We just want to give you a heads up that a suspicious person was asking about your class, and he registered. He might be from the government, but we don't know for sure. Well, just be aware and behave. Well, sure enough, the first class happened, and this is Boulder, Colorado, in the 1970s, and it was a pretty casual, cultural environment, and people would just hang out and come and learn how to make beer. We'd always make beer in class. We'd always taste beer from the class, that the beer that was made by the class before. And this one guy showed up, first class, and he came in and he was wearing a black pants, a white shirt, and a necktie, a skinny black necktie. And he looked like an agent to me. I mean, he was so out of place. But the first thing I did was pour everybody a homebrew, including him, and said, the basic ingredients of beer is this, and the process of making is that. But one thing you should know is that technically, it's not legal to make homebrew. So, but I said this. I said, but I think the government has better things to do than to be arresting home brewers. And so, as long as you don't sell your beer, I don't think they're going to bother you. But if you start making homebrew and start selling your beer, you might have some visitors, and of the unwanted kind. And that wouldn't be very cool. So I just want people to play it safe and not sell their homebrew. And it was for friends, family, and
sharing, right?
Sharing.
Right. And you delivered a very clear message. And did that guy, reappear in the subsequent class, or just one time show up?
Classes there were 5 weeks, once a week. And he came to the first class, and he learned how to make homebrew, and he took the wooden spoon and he stirred the pot, and he's tasting everything that we were pouring, and he was part of the conversation. He certainly was enjoying himself, probably one of the more pleasant projects he ever was on. And he came to the second class, but after that, I guess he had more better things, not so fun things to do.
Yeah, but I bet he find some joy at that time, during your class. And so that is one of the most interesting story I've heard about, I would say, spies that sit in the
Yeah.
homebrew club. Yeah, kind of. Okay, that's awesome. Uh, One thing that I could not imagine, given the fact that of how homebrewing knowledge and information, flooded, in today's world throughout the internet, waiting for people to just grab and pull and just digest, was how limited information was out there, half a century ago. And you mentioned that there were very very little books that's available, right? Some of those were from UK. So, based on this fact, does it inspire you to write your first book, The Joy of Home Brewing, in 1976?
Well, the beginning inspiration, I was teaching a class, and I had a 6-page typewritten uh,
Hmm.
handout that I would give people. And after I taught the classes for a few years, I had enough information, enough experience, and I was consistently making beers that people would enjoy.
Hmm.
And I self-published my first book, which, as you see, The Joy of Brewing. It was
Right.
about a 70-page typewritten, self-published book that I would hand out in the class, and it was, on sale at a few homebrew shops around the country, but not very many because I didn't know very many people that in those days.
Right.
And that was the beginning of the whole series. I self-published this, took the manuscript to the printer, they printed it, and then I picked it up, put it in my car, drove it back out to the house, and started handing them out. And I revised it in a few years later, and then back in 1982, around 1982, a publisher, New York City publisher, was interested in
Hmm.
me writing a big volume edition of the book.
Right.
And in 1984, that book came out, and it was The Complete Joy of Home Brewing. And that's the one that really, really took off.
Right. So for the listener, in modern time, the book is known as The Complete Joy of Home Brewing that Charlie mentioned, and it is now in the fourth edition, right? The latest one.
Yes, the fourth edition. Yes, I've revised it every 10 years, basically, since it was published. And I'll
Right.
probably forego the fifth edition because I don't know that I can make it any better. There are probably new hops and a few new ingredients and malts out there, but basically, the book is about good science,
Mhm.
good times, having fun, sharing, and making good beer. And the basic, if you enjoy those basics, you don't need all the most up-to-date information.
Mhm. So, for this first book that you wrote, like, how do you find the information to to compile to become this book? Like, did you have to go to the library, or mail someone from the brewing scientist world, or like
Well,
mhm.
the first editions of my book were all my own personal brewing experiences,
Oh,
and a
okay.
little bit of technical information that I was able to get from some of the British books.
Hmm.
But the 1984 edition of The Complete Joy of Home Brewing was the one that I really dived and immersed myself into the science. And I consulted with professional brewers at Coors Brewing and Anheuser-Busch, and I visited England and visited many breweries. I
Hmm.
learned a lot. I went to the Guinness Brewery. Just to give you an example um, of the kind of information that I was experiencing when I was traveling. My first visit to the UK and Ireland,
Hmm.
and I had a connection, and the connection allowed me to visit the brewery in Dublin, and all the homebrew books from England had recipes for stout, and they all called for using black malt or roasted barley malt, but you would boil it in the wort. You'd boil the
Interesting.
grains.
Hmm.
If anybody who out there is a home brewer now knows that if you boil grains, you can have a pretty black, caustic,
Right.
strong, roasted, undrinkable beer.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly enough, the British books said to do that, but they also said, you know, with stouts, you need to age it for 3 or 4 months before it gets smooth.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that was the common knowledge that was because there was a lot of misinformation. But when I visited the Guinness brewery, I got a tour of the brewery and I saw what they were putting into the beer and how they were making it. And the brewmaster there was talking to me and he said, you know, the beer that we're making right now, this stout, is
Mm-hmm.
going to be on sale across the street at the pub in 10 days. And I
Whoa.
go, oh my God, 10 days? Oh, there's something right about that, but I never knew it.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing with real ale in England. You know, if you
Mm-hmm.
go to pubs
Yeah.
and the beer was 10 days old from when it was brewed
Mm-hmm.
uh, and enjoyed. And so it was possible to make fundamentally, it's the fundamentals of making good beer
Mm-hmm.
uh, was to be learned. And once you knew that, you know, you make it like the pros, but you scale it down to 20 liters at a time
Right.
or 40 liters, whatever batch size as a home brewer. And that was what I was good at. I was good at scaling down the science and recognizing what parts of the science were relevant to small scale brewing and
Mm-hmm.
what parts of the science was not of interest and not of too much concern to home brewers.
Right. And that is the power of knowledge, as I believe, because once you know thing or you realize how things work, you can basically apply it into the push it into the better way to brew beer. I mean,
Right.
if you look into this aspect, right? Yeah. So thanks for the awesome story, Charlie. And I also have one theory. I'm not sure whether it is right, but I think that through your homebrewing experience and homebrewing class, the famous motto, relax, don't worry, have a homebrew was coined. Is that right?
Right. That's right. We
Okay.
were, my friend, I co founded the American Home Brewers Association with my friend. He was a school teacher as well. His name was
Yes.
Charlie Papazian. And we would take many trips together and with our homebrew into the wilderness, into the mountains, into the desert. And
Hmm.
whenever we confronted a problem, we'd always pull out a homebrew and say, "Hey, relax, don't worry, have a homebrew. Whatever problem we had, if we relaxed and didn't worry, the problem would fix itself." So,
Right.
and it was something that kind of stuck and it made its way into my book as a kind of fundamental attitude about learning. You know,
Hmm.
you know, you're going to make mistakes with home brewing. If you have adhered to a few fundamentals, you're going to make good beer. It may not turn out exactly the way you wanted it to the first time or the second time, but it's going to be good beer. So relax, don't worry, have your home brew and just keep learning and improving and don't feel that things are disastrous if you screw up every once in a while because everybody makes a mistake. So the whole premise of the other premise of the book was, you know, you can do it. It's sure doing something new that you've never done before isn't that whole idea is intimidating for a lot of things we do in life. And just try to inspire people to just kind of relax. You know, you're going to make good beer. You're going to be successful
Hmm. Hmm.
to some degree. And if you stick at it, you'll be very successful.
Hmm.
And at the same time, whether you're really successful or not, you're going to have a good time and you're going to have good beer.
Right. And I think that this phrase is probably gonna um, be kind of the set the right attitude that what you said for the people who want to step into this hobby to not be too stressful about, oh, I make this simple mistake and the beer is going to turn out horrible, or keep worrying about a lot of things. But if you just know the basic stuff first and you just build up the complexity over time and you enjoy doing it, at the same time, it's gonna keep rocking.
Yeah, that's one of the things. I make all grain beer now. I don't use malt extract, syrups, or powder.
Right.
I do sometimes, but rarely. The thing is, start simple, get
Right.
the process, get familiar with the process of making beer, and take little steps, and at the same time, always have some beer around that you can enjoy. So keep it simple, take steps, and improve as much as you want. There are all kinds of home brewers, and some people love to get into the hops or the yeast or the malt
Right.
or the fermentation or the gadgetry or who knows what else. But everybody chooses their path that they take that involves them with the beer making process. And the thing is, you can enjoy what you can choose what you want to enjoy.
Right. Right. So relax, don't worry, and have a homebrew.
That's
Everyone,
right.
just keep that in mind. Now, it seems like everything was, going fine for you during that time, enjoying life, right? Having a fun with a homebrew community, drinking tasty homebrew beers, but you did not stop the journey there. Somehow you seek to find what I consider to be as what's next. So in 1978, after homebrewing was legalized in US, you found American Homebrew Association, and you start publishing Symergy magazine. And a year later, you organized the first ever national homebrew competition. So what was happening in your mind for the introduction of all these things to the world?
Well, my friend Charlie Matson and I decided to publish a newsletter. That was the idea, and share the information and share recipes.
Right.
We didn't know that people were involved in changing the law. So the fact that the law was, homebrewing became legal in 1978, 79, that wasn't a factor for why we were going to found the American Home Brewers Association, not knowing that it was going to be legal. So, it started out as an idea to publish a newsletter, and we thought, well, boy, do we really want to do this? Because we're going to have, if we start taking people's money, we're going to charge $4 a year, I think. Not very much, but if we're going to take people's money, then we have to commit ourselves to coming out with a publication every 4 months, every 3 months.
Right.
And do we really want to make that commitment? So my friend Charlie and I, we drank a lot of homebrew for a year and discussed it over a lot of good times. Right. And we finally said, well, let's do it. Let's see what happens. And during that process of this whole idea coming together, the newsletter, the idea of having a newsletter became having a magazine. And that's what direction we were going to take. And then somehow we got an idea that we ought to have an organization called the American Home Brewers Association. And that became part of the plan. So it wasn't a business plan that we made. These ideas were just flowing out of our minds as we enjoyed our homebrew and inspired ourselves. And the reason for the turkey, for example, the reason for the turkey bird as the logo was that, Benjamin Franklin, a famous American from the 1700s, right. He wanted the American bird to be a wild turkey rather than the bald eagle, which it is, the bald eagle now. But the second place choice would have been a wild turkey. So we figured, well, USA can have the bald eagle. We'll take the turkey.
That's great. That's great. So the the American Homebrew Association is still, running till this day, as well as the Symergy magazine and the National Homebrew competition.
That's right.
So
Right.
yeah, it's one of the long last organization and event. And if you, I mean, the listener out there, if you got a chance, join the AHA, subscribe for the magazine, and visit the NSC from time to time if you can. Yeah, that's great, Charlie. I also understand that there is another event that AHA brings to the world, which is the Great American Beer Festival, starting from 1982, which is known to be as the U.S. largest craft beer festival in our time.
Mhm.
However, this festival has a very interesting origin, and I believe that it set foot outside U.S. soil. So let's hear about it from you, Charlie.
Yeah, had mentioned earlier that 1981, I visited the UK and England and Ireland. It was my first time to European
Hmm.
countries, and I had been invited. We had Zymergy and the American Home Brewers Association was 3 years old, and we were getting known
Hmm.
around the country and a little bit in England. And I was going to go visit my friend Michael Jackson, who's in this photograph here on the right
Right,
side,
right.
and hang out with him. And at the same time, I was invited to be a judge, the finals judge for the Great British Beer Festival in Leeds that year in England. And so when I walked into the Great British Beer Festival, it blew my mind. It was like, wow, this is a beer festival celebrating the love of beer
Hmm.
from a particular country, in that case, England. And I
Right.
said, what a interesting idea. And so, actually, at the Young's Pub in
Hmm.
London,
Hmm.
I was having a beer with Michael Jackson. It may have been that day that photograph was taken. I said, Michael, what do you think about if we started something like the Great American Beer Festival? And
Hmm.
he looked at me and he kind of laughed and he said, that's all well and fine, Charlie, but where are you going to get the beer? Because America was not known for having any good beer
Hmm.
or great beer at all or interesting beer. So
Right.
that was going to be a real challenge. I mean, he just laughed and we both had a good laugh over it. And I took that idea home. And there are a few hardcore homebrew enthusiasts that had, one was he worked for the microcomputer business, which
Hmm.
was just starting then. And it was his idea to call small breweries microbreweries because he said they're kind of like microcomputers, but they're breweries, microbreweries. So that's where the origins of that name came from. And another guy was one of assistant store manager for the biggest liquor store in Boulder, and he was a beer enthusiast.
Hmm.
And the other person, um, well, there was another person who had a distributor. He was a beer distributor, and he helped out as well. So um, we where were we going to get the beer? Where did we get the beer? How did we know what beers to get? There were no
Right.
books about beer in those days, right?
Hmm.
Nobody wrote about beer. Michael Jackson wrote his World Guide to Beer
Hmm.
in 1978, but American beers, there was nothing except the can collectors and the beer label collectors published books. And so we
Hmm.
found a book of beer labels, really nice coffee table books. And we went through there and we saw all the there were maybe 40 regional breweries in the country. And we saw some of them were making Bock beer
Hmm.
or especially regional beer or Oktoberfest beers. Some made a stout, some made cream ales, a few, eccentric, different kinds of beers. And we asked those brewers whether they would contribute the beer. And we had a friend that was also part of the organizing committee. He was a brewmaster at the Boulder Beer Company, and he knew some of these brewers in different parts of the country. So I have to hand it to these brewers. We asked for the beer and they sent maybe 10 cases of beer to these crazy people in Boulder, Colorado that wanted to put on a party. Because you understand that there was no beer festivals in the United States. A beer festival in the United States was, in those days, was what we call keggers, when a brewery would sponsor a party with a lot of kegs of beer, the same kind of beer, and people would just get loaded and drunk. And it wasn't about the beer; it was just about
drinking. Drinking. Right. Wow, that's a lot of work, right? And I believe this is the photo of the first GABF in 1982.
Right.
And it's
in a hotel, people, 5,000 square foot. That'd be about 500 square meters. Ballrooms, small ballroom hotel, in Boulder, Colorado, and there was about 600-700 people that came, mostly home brewers or friends of home brewers, because those were the only people that understood what we were trying to do. And I remember some of the regional brewmasters were there from Minnesota and different parts of the country, and they looked at these people. They couldn't believe their eyes and ears. They said, all these people are in this room and they're talking about the beer.
Right.
Most beer events, people didn't talk about the beer, but there was a lot to talk about, the flavors and the companies and where they were from. And they were just flabbergasted because never would a brewery share the same roof with a competitor and present their beers. That just would never happen. And so having 20 different breweries showcasing about 40 different beers under one roof was a very unique thing to happen.
Right. Like a groundbreaking event for those brewery as well.
Exactly. It was the beginning. It was the beginning, and from that point on, people figured, well, these guys might not be successful, but they have enthusiasm and passion. We all did. And all the labor, all the people that helped out were volunteers because they were just excited to be a part of it. And what we did, was it legal? Who knows? We never asked. Because there were no laws that said you could or couldn't do it, because no one ever had the idea before.
Right? Yeah. Yeah, what a story, Charlie. Thank you so much. I mean, for what you have created, and as well as your college back then. So, yeah. Now let's move back to the hands-on side of the story, the home brewing itself. You mentioned at the beginning of this session that you are still homebrew, of course, right?
Yes.
Do you still brew about 12 to 15 batches a year averagely, right?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would guess that, given the long history, the experience you've been through visiting all those breweries and maybe homebrew suppliers through times, I guess now you are brewing on a shiny stainless steel 3-vessel system, automated, jacketed conical fermenter, right?
That's what most people think, including yourself, but that's not true.
No,
I like to keep things simple.
Okay,
I know a lot of home brewers that get those shiny gadgets, and the brewery gets bigger, and you spend more time setting it up, cleaning it, and I see people move away from the hobby because it's too much of a labor and not a labor of love. So I like to keep things simple. I use the equipment and the procedures that, people aren't going to believe this, but that towel, that red towel says beer.
Yeah.
Our 10-gallon pot, which is, you can see in the lower right-hand corner on the propane heater.
Right.
I brew outside when the weather is warmer, but that's what I mash in. I get the temperature up, do a step mash, add boiling water, and I wrap towels around it, and it keeps the temperature relatively stable. It's not perfect. If you're ever
Right.
going to be a professional brewer, I don't advise making beer this way because there's a little bit of inconsistency. But if you know your system and you know what you're doing on a small scale, you can
Right.
get pretty consistent results. So, yeah, the mash vessel is there, and then I ladle it into a on the upper right hand side. You can
Right.
see the plastic buckets.
Bucket, yeah.
That bucket on top is full of hot water, and it sparges it, and it
Right.
comes down and it rinses the grains that are
Mhm.
in the lower bucket.
Uh-huh.
And there's a gravity feed that goes into the stainless steel pot. And
Yeah.
so gravity, no pumps, hand ladling, and
Right.
I can do an all grain beer from mash in to final
Transfer.
cleanup of everything.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Pitching the yeast in 5 hours. I
Wow,
can do that.
that's
Sometimes
super
4.5, but 5
efficient.
hours, and that's everything.
Right.
I mean, I can just walk away after 5 hours, and I'm done, and everything's clean and put away.
Right. So this is your, what do you call it? Like a man cave, brew cabin?
Yeah, it's a garage turned into a man cave, I guess. Man brewing cave.
And you mentioned that you mostly keg your beer at this time, right? But
Yes.
still bottle from time to time if it's required.
Yes, you're right.
That's great. So keep it simple. You found your way, that's what you mentioned, and then you still enjoy doing it over and over again. So just find what is right for you, and this is what works for Charlie, and he still enjoy doing it. And this is probably one of the simplest system that I've seen over time, but it's still functional and efficient and produce good beer, right?
And I'm just a note that I'm fermenting in glass carboys, 6.5 gallons, 20 to what is it, 25 liters at a time in glass. And I have temperature controls in part of this garage. I have a walk-in cooler that I keep at, no, I'm going to say in Fahrenheit, but it's 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 54 degrees Fahrenheit, which is cellar temperature. And then I have a commercial refrigerator, a 3-door refrigerator that I keep closer to just above freezing, a few degrees warmer than freezing, that I can lager. So my ales, I will cellar in the walk-in cooler, and I can warm ferment in this particular room. And when I want to lager a beer, I can do the primary ferment in the cellar, primary fermentation, and then I can lager in the colder refrigerator. So I don't have vessels that are temperature controlled. I have spaces that are temperature controlled.
Right. And you are the temperature controller.
Yes, I am. And I have a very sophisticated thermometer.
Right.
It just reads how hot or cold it is.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Charlie, there's another interesting story about your house yeast strain. So can you share the story with us? Like, I heard it dates back to 1983.
Yes. I still use this yeast. Back in the 80s, I was my name, the American Home Brewers Association was starting to get a little momentum, and they knew we were passionate, and I was invited by the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, District St. Louis, to give a talk at one of their meetings in St. Louis, Missouri. Now, this is Anheuser-Busch's home.
Right.
And the guy who invited me, he was very enthusiastic about me coming and talking about what we were doing in Boulder, Colorado, and what we were doing with home brewers, because this is a group of brewmasters. These were not marketers or CEOs or accountants or financial advisors. These were brewers. So they loved the idea that younger people than them, people like me and my friends loved the idea of making beer, making good beer, and they invited me to come and talk about what we were doing. And so I said, sure, I'll come. And he said, all right. And a week later, he called me and he said, what do you think of maybe we can have one of your beers? You can make it and you can brew it and we can enjoy it. And I said, well, now things were getting pretty serious because I was still using dry ale yeast and dry lager yeast, which was pretty, I was able to make good beer with it, but it wasn't very good. And I said, well, I guess I shouldn't have, but I said, yeah, I'll do it. And then that went over well. And then a week later, he said, I've been talking to Ball Corporation, the biggest can company in the world, right? They make cans for all over the world. And he said, we're talking about to some other suppliers and such. You know what we're going to do? We're going to put your beer in commemorative cans. And I said, how are you going to do that? Yeah. Well, we'll send you kegs. You put them in the kegs. We'll bring it to St. Louis. And then we have an very old canning line in the basement of the brewery in St. Louis that hasn't been used. And nobody knows when the last time it was used. And we'll use that canning line and we'll put your beer in those cans. And I said, oh boy, what have I got myself into? Yeah. So one of the first things I did to answer your question directly here was like, boy, if I'm going to make good beer, I know I can make good beer with malt extract. I can make better beer if I had some good yeast. I knew enough about yeast, but you couldn't buy liquid yeast.
Yes.
If you did, it cost maybe $100 in those days to get a slant, a few cells that you'd culture up. So I had friends at Coors Brewing Company, and that bottle says Coors Lager. It wasn't Coors Lager yeast, but it was yeast that I got from their frozen collection of yeast from all over the world. And one of my friends, he said, well, I'm going to give you some yeast, but I can't tell you where it's from, where its origins are, but it's a good yeast. And so I got a little vial of yeast, and I cultured it up in the bottles, and that's what I put in these carboys to ferment beer. And I also had an ale yeast, so I made a Bock beer and I made a Scottish ale.
Okay.
So half the keg, there are 4 kegs there that were Bock beer and 4 kegs that were Scottish ale. And this is a long story, but the beers were successful. They were good quality. They didn't go sour miraculously. They got into the cans. I mean, most of the cans flew off the line. To give you an idea, there was probably one whole keg that just filled the lines before the beer started coming out. So, it was a pretty rough time trying to can these beers, but they did it, and people enjoyed it, and they commended me on the quality of the beer. It was a really good Bock beer, real good discussion, made from malt extract with some hops I found and put it, good hops, but I never knew what, this origins of this yeast was, the lager yeast. I used that lager yeast for years. I would culture it and keep it going. I use it to make imperial stouts. I'd use it to make real ales. I'd use it to make Bock lagers, German pilses, all kinds of beers. And the distinction between lagers and ales, in my mind, was mostly a fermentation temperature issue. So when I would use this lager yeast at warm ale fermentation temperatures, I would get fruity characters. I get a different character in the beer that would resemble ale. But the nice thing about this yeast is that even in bottle conditioning it, you could keep it cold and therefore preserve it, and it would still ferment and still condition in the bottle. You could carbonate the bottle in a cold environment. So I was doing that for 20, 30 years. And eventually I had a friend of mine who took my beer making class.
Okay.
He was the brewmaster at one of their smaller breweries.
Mm-hmm.
And I told him, I still have the name of the code name for this lager yeast that was given to me back in 1983. Do you think you could find out where this yeast came from? And he investigated, and he called me up and he said, "Charlie, are you sitting down?" And I said, "Why do I need to sit down?" He said, "I advise you sitting down because I'm going to tell you where this yeast came from.
Okay.
This yeast was originally cultured from a keg of Budweiser." So, when I said that, I said it was probably the happiest Budweiser yeast ever to exist.
Yes.
I annoyed a lot of the Anheuser-Busch people when they heard me say that. I shouldn't have said that because it had so much fun brewing imperial stouts and barley wines and wheat ales and lager beers, all kinds of beers. And it's done me well. And White Labs now has it. It's available through White Labs. It's called Fist Bump. Charlie's Fist Bump.
Charlie Fist Bump.
1983. Fist Bump is
right.
I used to do at the Great American Beer Festival when people got up on stage instead of.
Yeah. So sounds like this yeast is very versatile, right? And
very versatile and very hardy. And
really well.
a couple of times it got infected with wild yeast, and I stopped using it. And then after 2 or 3 years, I cultured it up again and tried it again, and it was fine. And what happened, obviously, was that the cultured lager yeast was very resilient, very hardy, very healthy. But the wild yeast that had infected it earlier died off.
Oh, it can't compete.
They weren't as healthy and as resistant to age as this yeast. And as a matter of fact, one time I had the opportunity to try and culture the sediment from a 25-year-old bottle of my Bock beer, and I was successful at reculturing the yeast that was at the bottom of that bottle after 25 years. Wow. So there's a lot of books about yeast, and the theory is that this shouldn't happen.
Yeah, it shouldn't work.
If the conditions are right, and I won't go into those conditions, but if the conditions are right, it can happen.
You can happen. You can make it happen. Yeah, right. And it works. Proved by your own practice. Oh, that's wonderful, awesome stories, Charlie. Budweiser yeast. And do you still keep using it to this day?
I still use it. I brewed a batch last week. I pitched it. It's fermenting right now. It's I call it a Schwarzbier, a German style black lager.
Yes.
And I warm fermented a bit, and then I put it in the cooler, and then I put it in lager, and I lager it for 6 or 8 weeks, and it's a nice black lager, dry hop with American Cascade hops, which is something people don't do. I mean, commercial breweries don't dry hop a German style Schwarzbier Cascade hops. It makes a good beer.
Yeah, but it's your beer, and you enjoy it. So here you go. Next, so you have traveled the world, right? Meeting with various people and experiencing an array of wonderful cultures. And probably drank like millions pints of beer, and with or without knowing it, you have been planting and spreading home brewing awesomeness across the globe, in my opinion. And I think that you also have observed tons of events that revolve around home brewing world over time. So my question to you is, how do you find home brewing nowadays, given its evolution from 1970 to present time?
Well, yeah, that's a really interesting question. If we had an hour, we could talk about just that.
Sure.
Home brewing has evolved. I mean, the
Mhm.
fundamentals of brewing is still hasn't evolved that much. The equipment has evolved, the knowledge base has evolved and improved.
Mhm.
You know, when I first started, the reason why we brewed was because we couldn't find the beers we liked.
Yeah.
You had to make them.
Yeah.
But what we also tapped into was the enjoyment of sharing something that you made yourself
Mhm.
and the enjoyment of experimenting. We, you know, we were throwing spices and herbs in beer. We were putting fruit in beer, um, and odd ingredients. And we even put honey in beer. And that was revolutionary. I mean, that was truly putting honey in beer was just so unheard of. Brewmasters who had spent their entire life learning how to make beer, professionals, couldn't relate. They said, "Why would you ever want to put honey in beer? Why would you want to put herbs or spices? Why would you make sour beers?" You know, those things have all evolved. In the early days, if you made sour beer, you usually threw it out.
Right.
Nowadays, you know, you culture a certain balance of sourness with other ingredients to make something that's pleasant to drink.
Mhm.
So, you know, the reason to brew in any culture is, I think, is fun. The fundamental reason is the joy of sharing and camaraderie, whether
Mhm.
it's men or women,
Mhm.
young or old, to the left of the political spectrum, to the right of the political spectrum. You always find all kinds of people love to get together over a beer and talk about what they're doing. And you know, the real world's, you know, all the stress and all the conflict that's in the real world these days, you kind of just you can work your way through it and have moments that you truly enjoy with the camaraderie of maybe your friends that you've known and maybe the friends that you just made. And that's really a really strong element of why home brewing has been so successful um, over the years.
Right. So pretty much is that the landscape may shape, but the core, the fundamental structure of the home brewing still well maintained, well kept. People
Yes.
gonna keep evolving over time, but the spirit is still what it is.
Yeah, and
Can I say
homebrewers have
that?
always been experimental, and you know,
Right.
right from the start, anything we made was experiment because nobody had ever done it before,
Yes.
that we knew of. There were no records, so we were doing it on our own. And to this day, the home brewers, the homebrew community is the core and the foundation of what the professional craft brewing, microbrewing, the people who make beer for sale, um, it's wise for them to embrace what homebrewers are doing and observe what they're doing, because most of the revolutionary ideas have evolved from a homebrew batch somewhere.
Got it. Got it. So, Charlie, there is one thing that I could recall from one of the conversation we had several years back about your decision not to enter to professional brewing arena, which from time to time tempts many home brewers, and yet you still hold your position well. So I have one last question before we end the session, which is, after all this time, what is home brewing to you?
What is home brewing to me? It Over the years, it has been my connection to the world of brewing
Mhm.
and making people's the challenges that professionals have. Um, it makes them more real to me. You know, if I'm working with malt and hops, and barley and gadgets and yeast, and I'm reading about equipment, and uh, you know, it makes I'm in touch with, to a certain degree. I can relate to everything a professional brewer is doing Of course, I'm on a small scale, but I can talk. I can talk and I can relate and I can be relevant. I can have a relevant conversation about just about any aspect of brewing, whether it's sales, marketing, labels, media, what the consumer thinks, how to evaluate beer, judging beer, the best malt for this kind of beer, the best fermentation process. I don't know it all, but I know enough to ask questions, intelligent questions. So I'm always picking people's brains. That's part of my ongoing education. I mean, there's always something new. I still visit many dozens of breweries every year that I've never been to. And I'm still always amazed at the innovation, ingenuity and the innovation that continues to happen. I mean, there's things that I've never, a brewery can open up next week. And if I visit them, there'll be something that they're doing that I've never seen before. Some way of doing things or a beer that they're making or a unique process or a unique ingredient. It's just, so that's what home brewing, I can relate to it because I always have something fermenting at home. That way I know even when I'm away, there's something good happening at home.
Well, that is an absolutely fantastic answer, and it is a perfect closing speech for this session. Charlie, I couldn't thank you enough for what you have created, influenced, motivated, and contribute to not only the home brewing world community, but also the world of beer in general.
Mhm.
So I have to say, thank you so much for your time coming to our platform, sharing all those wonderful photos, and walk us through homebrewing stories through your eyes. And we greatly appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Napat. That's really, I know we met probably about 7 or 8 years ago in Dachau, I think it was called.
Yeah. The wooden house bar, right?
Yes.
Yeah. That was the first
And
time.
they were good times, and I continue to have good times. And I'm looking forward to my next trip to your country, Thailand. And I know there's lots of interesting and good things happening there and good beer. Every time I've been there, it gets better and better and better. It's like you don't have to go far now if you live in Thailand to get good beer.
Yeah. So, and I assure that this will not be the last time we talk in this platform. And I look forward to see you again in a future session, or perhaps in Boulder, Colorado, or in Thailand, maybe.
Well, there's always a glass for you.
Yeah, a glass for me, just for now. But yeah, enjoy, Charlie. Thank you, and appreciate your contribution. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
Take care. Yeah, cheers. All right, everyone. All right. This is too much for me to comprehend. What a great story. What a great time. And I hope that we all had a good burp together. The Good Burp session will be back in several weeks, so stay tuned. Until next time, cheers and sawasdee krap.